The prestigious halls of Westbridge Academy carried an air of exclusivity, where the children of executives and politicians thrived, and scholarship students like Jamal Carter were barely tolerated. In the grand mathematics classroom, students sat stiffly in their seats, their designer uniforms crisp, their expensive books neatly stacked on their desks. The only one who stood out was Jamal, his worn-out notebook filled with scribbled equations, his backpack fraying at the edges, a stark contrast to the privileged world around him. Mrs. Thornton, a sharp-eyed, middle-aged teacher, commanded the room with a presence that made students shrink in their chairs. She rarely acknowledged Jamal, except for when she wanted to make an example of him. That day, she paced in front of the chalkboard, the sharp click of her heels echoing with authority. Without warning, she stopped, turned, and lifted a piece of chalk. "All right, class. Who here thinks they can solve this?" she asked, her voice crisp as she began writing. The chalk glided across the board, leaving behind an intricate, nearly unsolvable equation. The numbers and symbols sprawled across the surface like a foreign language, something far beyond their current curriculum. A heavy silence followed. Students exchanged nervous glances, shifting in their seats. Not a single hand was raised. Mrs. Thornton smirked. She had expected as much. Turning slowly, she let her gaze land on Jamal, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with false encouragement, "why don't you come up here and give it a try?" A few students snickered, nudging each other. They all knew what this was, a setup, another attempt to embarrass the scholarship kid who had no business being in their world. Jamal didn't flinch. He met Mrs. Thornton's gaze with steady composure. "All right," he said simply, rising from his seat. The room went still. They weren't expecting that. He wasn't supposed to accept the challenge. With quiet confidence, he strode to the front of the class, taking the chalk from the teacher's outstretched hand. The air was thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room watched, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. Mrs. Thornton folded her arms, barely containing her smirk, already anticipating his failure. Jamal examined the equation, his fingers tightening around the chalk. Then, without hesitation, he began to write. Jamal stared at the equation, his expression unreadable, his fingers tightening around the chalk. The silence in the room was thick with expectation, but not the kind that hoped for success. It was the kind that anticipated failure. Mrs. Thornton took a slow step forward, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Take your time, dear. We wouldn't want you embarrassing yourself." Laughter rippled through the class, low chuckles and amused whispers as students leaned toward each other, waiting for Jamal to stumble. Bradley, lounging in his seat, smirked. "Don't worry, Jamal. We'll help you spell your name if you get stuck." A fresh wave of laughter followed, some students slapping their desks as if the insult were the most hilarious thing they had ever heard. A few glanced at Mrs. Thornton, waiting for her to scold Bradley, but she didn't. She just folded her arms, looking amused, watching Jamal as if this were a game she had already won. But Jamal didn't react. He didn't fidget, didn't look down, didn't waver. He exhaled once, slow and controlled, then raised his hand and placed the chalk against the board. The laughter began to fade. The first symbol appeared, crisp and precise, then another, and another. The class fell into silence. Jamal's movements were steady, unhurried, yet deliberate. He wasn't scribbling randomly, wasn't stalling. He was solving the equation, step by step, piece by piece. Mrs. Thornton's smirk began to fade. Bradley, who had been resting his head on his hand, slowly sat up straighter, his brows knitting together in confusion. The students who had been whispering moments before were now staring, watching as each number and symbol fell into place, leading towards something none of them had expected. Jamal's fingers moved smoothly, his mind years ahead of them, unraveling the complex formula as if it were second nature. The chalk tapped lightly against the board as he wrote out the final step. then set it down with quiet finality. And then he turned. The classroom was dead silent. Every eye was fixed on the board, scanning his work, waiting for a flaw, an error, anything that could justify their assumptions about him. There was none. The equation was solved. Perfectly. Jamal met Mrs. Thornton's gaze, his expression calm. "Was that slow enough for you?" Mrs. Thornton's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. But nothing came. The authority in her stance had crumbled. The certainty in her voice was gone. Jamal had just done the impossible, and now, for the first time, it was Mrs. Thornton who looked like she didn't belong in that classroom. Mrs. Thornton's frown deepened as she stepped closer to the board, gripping the chalk tightly. Her eyes darted across the equation, retracing each calculation, checking every step. The room was so silent that the faint scratching of her nails against the board could be heard. Then she stopped. Her fingers froze mid-air. Her eyes widened. It was correct. Every step, every number, every fraction. The weight of the realization settled over her, but she refused to let it show. Swallowing hard, she turned toward Jamal, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That can't be right," she muttered, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her usual confidence. Jamal, still composed, took a step back and crossed his arms. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to say anything more, but when he spoke, his voice was cool, deliberate. "I'm done, ma'am," he said evenly. "Unless you'd like me to explain it to you?" A collective gasp rippled through the class. Bradley's jaw hung open, his smirk long gone. Other students, the same ones who had snickered earlier, exchanged stunned glances. Some whispered in shock. A few leaned forward as if seeing Jamal for the first time. Mrs. Thornton's face turned a deep shade of red. She turned back to the board, searching for any mistake, any possible flaw, anything that could allow her to take back control. She found nothing. This was a fluke," she said through clenched teeth. "You must have memorized it from somewhere." Jamal shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Would you like me to solve another?" The room erupted into hushed chaos. Students muttered in disbelief, some nudging each other, others shaking their heads in admiration. Even the ones who had mocked him earlier now stared at him with a new kind of respect. The equation was solved. Perfectly. Mrs. Thornton gritted her teeth. Her authority, her entire lesson plan for the day, had just been shattered. And the worst part, she had set herself up for it. "Sit down, Carter," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. But before Jamal could take his seat, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the murmurs. "No, don't sit down." All heads turned toward the doorway. A man in a sharp navy blue suit stood there, arms crossed. His presence alone commanded attention. The principal. Mrs. Thornton stiffened, her posture suddenly rigid. Jamal remained still, his face unreadable. The entire room held its breath. The room remained frozen in shock, every pair of eyes fixed on the doorway. Dr. Leonard Hayes, one of the most respected mathematicians in the country, stood tall, his presence alone sending ripples of awe through the classroom. The students gawked, some whispering in disbelief. "Is that the doctor?" "Hayes?" one student murmured under his breath. Mrs. Thornton visibly stiffened, her fingers curling into her palm as she forced a tight smile. What are you doing here?" she stammered, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the moment. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the chalkboard before settling on Jamal. In his hand, he held a crisp letter, the university seal embossed on the top. "I came to speak with your principal regarding the school's advanced mathematics program," he said, his tone measured. "But then, I happened to witness something unexpected." Jamal remained still, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something unreadable. Dr. Hayes turned fully toward him. "Young man, where did you learn to do that?" he asked, gesturing toward the solved equation on the board. Jamal met his gaze without hesitation. "I like math," he said simply. Dr. Hayes let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in admiration. "No," he corrected. "You're a genius." Mrs. Thornton gritted her teeth. Her authority, her entire lesson plan for the day, had just been shattered. And the worst part, she had set herself up for it. "Sit down, Carter," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. But before Jamal could take his seat, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the murmurs. "No, don't sit down." All heads turned toward the doorway. A man in a sharp navy blue suit stood there, arms crossed. His presence alone commanded attention. The principal. Mrs. Thornton stiffened, her posture suddenly rigid. Jamal remained still, his face unreadable. The entire room held its breath. The room remained frozen in shock, every pair of eyes fixed on the doorway. Dr. Leonard Hayes, one of the most respected mathematicians in the country, stood tall, his presence alone sending ripples of awe through the classroom. The students gawked, some whispering in disbelief. "Is that the doctor?" "Hayes?" one student murmured under his breath. Mrs. Thornton visibly stiffened, her fingers curling into her palm as she forced a tight smile. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the moment. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the chalkboard before settling on Jamal. In his hand, he held a crisp letter, the university seal embossed on the top. "I came to speak with your principal regarding the school's advanced mathematics program," he said, his tone measured. "But then, I happened to witness something unexpected." Jamal remained still, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something unreadable. Dr. Hayes turned fully toward him. "Young man, where did you learn to do that?" he asked, gesturing toward the solved equation on the board. Jamal met his gaze without hesitation. "I like math," he said simply. Dr. Hayes let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in admiration. "No," he corrected. "You're a genius." Mrs. Thornton gritted her teeth. Her authority, her entire lesson plan for the day, had just been shattered. And the worst part, she had set herself up for it. "Sit down, Carter," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. But before Jamal could take his seat, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the murmurs. "No, don't sit down." All heads turned toward the doorway. A man in a sharp navy blue suit stood there, arms crossed. His presence alone commanded attention. The principal. Mrs. Thornton stiffened, her posture suddenly rigid. Jamal remained still, his face unreadable. The entire room held its breath. The room remained frozen in shock, every pair of eyes fixed on the doorway. Dr. Leonard Hayes, one of the most respected mathematicians in the country, stood tall, his presence alone sending ripples of awe through the classroom. The students gawked, some whispering in disbelief. "Is that the doctor?" "Hayes?" one student murmured under his breath. Mrs. Thornton visibly stiffened, her fingers curling into her palm as she forced a tight smile. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the moment. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the chalkboard before settling on Jamal. In his hand, he held a crisp letter, the university seal embossed on the top. "I came to speak with your principal regarding the school's advanced mathematics program," he said, his tone measured. "But then, I happened to witness something unexpected." Jamal remained still, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something unreadable. Dr. Hayes turned fully toward him. "Young man, where did you learn to do that?" he asked, gesturing toward the solved equation on the board. Jamal met his gaze without hesitation. "I like math," he said simply. Dr. Hayes let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in admiration. No, he corrected. You're a genius. The weight of those words sent another wave of murmurs through the class. Some students exchanged stunned glances. Others stared at Jamal as if seeing him for the first time. Even the ones who had laughed at him earlier now sat in uncomfortable silence. Bradley, the wealthy student who had mocked him just minutes ago, slowly sank into his chair, his confidence deflating like a popped balloon. Mrs. Thornton, desperate to reclaim some sense of control, cleared her throat. Well, I always knew Jamal had potential, she said with an airy laugh, attempting to rewrite the narrative. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his expression cool. That's interesting, ma'am, he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to be heard by everyone. Because 5 minutes ago, you were trying to embarrass me. The air in the room turned electric. A few students let out soft gasps, while others exchanged wide-eyed looks. Mrs. Thornton's forced smile faltered, her face paling. Dr. Hayes arched a brow, his gaze flicking between the teacher and the student. He folded his arms, his expression unreadable. I'd like to hear more about that, he said smoothly. The weight of Dr. Hayes's words sent a shockwave through the room. The students who had been laughing minutes ago were now speechless, their eyes darting between Jamal and their flustered teacher. Mrs. Thornton, who had spent the entire lesson trying to humiliate him, now looked like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Dr. Hayes turned fully to Jamal, his expression filled with admiration. I teach at MIT, and I've never seen a student your age solve that equation so quickly. Have you ever considered skipping high school and going straight to college? The class erupted into gasps. A few students audibly whispered, MIT? Others exchanged stunned glances, as if trying to process what had just been said. Even those who had mocked Jamal earlier now sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Thornton visibly stiffened. She opened her mouth but hesitated, her face paling as the reality of the situation settled in. What? College? But he's… She stopped herself mid-sentence, the unspoken words heavy in the air. Dr. Hayes slowly raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. He's what, Mrs. Thornton? Silence. The question hung there like a dagger. Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard, realizing that any answer she gave would only make her look worse. She fumbled for words, her confidence draining by the second. Dr. Hayes smirked slightly, sensing her discomfort. Then, without another glance at her, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. He turned back to Jamal and handed it to him. I'm offering you a full scholarship to my summer program. If you do well, I'll personally recommend you for early admission to MIT. Jamal stared at the card, his fingers shaking slightly as he took it. Are you serious? His voice was quiet, almost unsure, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Dr. Hayes grinned. Genius should never be wasted. The murmurs in the class grew louder. Some students whispered excitedly, while others sat frozen in disbelief. Even the ones who had once looked down on Jamal couldn't ignore the gravity of what had just happened. Mrs. Thornton looked like she was about to faint. Her carefully constructed image of authority had shattered in a matter of minutes. At the back of the room, Bradley, the rich student who had mocked Jamal earlier, slumped lower into his seat. His smirk had long disappeared, replaced with a look of disbelief and envy. He had spent years assuming he was the smartest student in the room, but now he realized he wasn't even close. Jamal finally looked up, his confidence growing with each second. He straightened his shoulders, smiled, and met Dr. Hayes's gaze. Thank you, sir. I'd love that. The class erupted, not in laughter this time, but in genuine applause. That evening, Jamal walked home, his fingers still gripping the business card like it was the most valuable thing in the world. The weight of everything that had happened that day pressed on his chest, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him feel something new. confidence, validation. For the first time, he felt truly seen. As he stepped through the front door, his mother looked up from the couch, immediately noticing the shift in his energy. "Baby, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched in her face. Jamal swallowed hard, then held up the card. "Mom, I got into an MIT summer program." Her eyes widened. "What?" He repeated it, this time with a smile breaking across his face. "Dr. Leonard Hayes, one of the top mathematicians in the country, offered me a scholarship, and if I do well, he'll help me get into MIT early." Tears welled up in his mother's eyes. She cupped his face with both hands, her voice trembling. "I told you, baby. You're special. I always knew it." Jamal exhaled, the tension of the day finally melting away in his mother's embrace. Meanwhile, back at school, the aftermath of that day's events rippled through the halls. Mrs. Thornton, once untouchable in her authority, now faced a full investigation for discrimination. Parents had started asking questions, and students whispered about how she had tried to humiliate the wrong person. The administration had no choice but to review past complaints, ones that had previously been ignored. Bradley, the rich kid who once mocked Jamal, made a weak attempt at congratulating him. "Hey man, that was pretty cool," he said, forcing a smile. Jamal didn't bother responding. He simply looked at Bradley, his expression unreadable, before walking away. He didn't need validation from someone who had only ever seen him as a joke. But the rest of the school had changed. The whispers that used to follow Jamal in the halls weren't mocking anymore. They were full of awe. "Did you hear? He's going to MIT. He solved that equation faster than anyone. They say he's a genius." And as Jamal packed his bags for MIT's summer program, the reality of his future began to sink in. He wasn't just the scholarship kid anymore. He was Jamal, the genius. A screenshot of MIT's website, featuring his name as the youngest student ever accepted into their advanced mathematics division. Mrs. Thornton sitting alone in an empty classroom, staring at the board, realizing that she had tried to belittle the wrong student.